Okay, everyone, I am so thrilled to be talking today with Howard and Jake Ross. Howard and Jake, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much, Michael.
Hey, Michael, it's
Right.
great to see you.
It's so great to see you. Let me tell the listeners about you guys first, and then we'll dive into the conversation. So, Howard Ross is the author of some incredible books: Reinventing Diversity, Transforming Organizational Community to Strengthen People, Purpose, and Performance, and Our Search for Belonging: How Our Need to Connect is Tearing Us Apart, Everyday Bias, which we're going to talk a lot about because he's co-writing that with Jake, the second edition of that book. Howard's work has been published by Harvard Business Review, Washington Post, New York Times, Forbes. He's worked with Fortune 500 companies across a variety of industries. He's a lifelong social justice advocate, founding partner of the nationally recognized diversity consulting firm, Cook Ross. Howard still speaks broadly with his new company, Hudarta Consulting, and he lives in the Shenandoah Valley, just west of Washington, D.C. If you have any familiarity with the DEI space, you know Howard is a legend. His son, Jake, is a specialist in interpersonal psychology with a background in the exploration of belonging and its influence on well-being. He has Masters of Applied Positive Psychology from the University of Pennsylvania. With his consulting firm, Belong Together, he consults with organizations, startups, individuals on creating cultures of belonging in the workplace. He also curates events and gatherings that create opportunities for community building and authentic connection, which scale from small community gatherings up to corporate team building. And Jake is working now on building mission-driven communities within the AI industry, bridging the gap between technical expertise and compassionate communication. So you can bet we are going to talk about that. So can we just dive in? I know you two are both here because you're collaborating on the second
Mhm.
edition of this book, Everyday Bias, that you originally wrote, Howard. Um, it's certainly one of the most influential, if not the most influential book on bias in the workplace, out of the workplace. Before we get into what's new with the second edition, Howard, what are the most important takeaways from that book that listeners should know before the discussion on what's changed?
Great. Thank you, Michael. Thank you so much for that generous introduction. I really do appreciate it. Um, yeah, it's interesting. I got into looking at looking at the subject of bias originally, mostly because it was like, how can we fix people? How can we make people stop doing things that are bad? Um, And like a lot of times, if you do honest research and you're open to what you find, what I found was, oops, maybe people aren't so bad as I thought they were. And then underneath it is this phenomenon, which is very human and which we can all relate to. And that is that we make decisions really much more based on our feelings than we realize that we do, and much less on reasoning. In fact, my one line mantra for this whole body of study of 25 years of study is human beings are not rational as much as we're rationalizing. And I think that
Good.
that's really was a breakthrough for me. And so it completely shifted for me the way we had to do the work of developing human understanding. I mean, DE&I for me is a subset of the work that I've always done, which is how do we raise human consciousness and develop human understanding. And if we begin to realize that most of us don't even know why we think the things that we think, and sometimes don't even know that we're thinking the things that we're thinking, it's very difficult to get to any kind of understanding either of oneself or of others.
Yeah. Yeah. Gosh. I mean, you're speaking my language. I'm fascinated
Of
by that
course.
human cognition stuff, brain functioning, emotions, decision making. It's really fascinating. Jake, that obviously resonates with you as well with what you study. Like, how does what you study fit in with what Howard originally wrote in this book?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for the question. So, what I focused much more on the interpersonal dynamics and community dynamics within belonging, and the way that it tends to meld together in specificity. I mean, broadly, it's all the same conversation, which is how do we come together, and what is it that has us lean more or less into a certain group or community where we find ourselves identified. But the more when we talk about bias and the way that it affects how we engage with groups. What interests me and where Howard and I first uh, it's funny, I was going to say crossed paths. Um, where we first began intellectually collaborating is on the way that bias informs the way we create our perception of the in-group out-group. And that's actually what's directed a lot of my work. And not to sort of spoil where the conversation is going, but looking at, with the upcoming edition of the book, how bias in social media and the digital space, as we evolve from physical third places and the physical face-to-face community into digital community, bias influences our capacity to select where we show up and how we want to show up. And this self-selection bias and echo chamber cultivation influences the way that we continue to grow forward, because we can much more readily pick who influences us. There's a notion, show me your friends and I'll show you your future. And I
Right.
think that it's a lot easier these days to choose who those friends and role models are when all it takes is a click instead of conscious physical realignment. And so that's sort of where it shows up in my interests.
Ooh, there's a lot there. We're going to have to put a pin in that. We are definitely coming back to that. Sticking with this idea of bias, though, before we move on, Howard, in terms of organizations and organizational culture, what's been the biggest impact of that book and that work for organizations? Is there, and how have organizations been able to kind of incorporate the ideas from that book and actually do something about it?
Well, I think it's at multiple levels, Michael. I think first of all, there are lots of leaders, thousands of leaders who we worked with over years, um, who I think saw their own decision making improved, were able to see how they might have had blind spots about employees or coworkers. So I think on an individual level, I think there are a lot of people who were able to use the awareness that that work brought to to impact relationship issues that they had with other people they were working with or with teams that they were working with. And in some cases, even the overall strategies of the organizations and the way they related to outside communities, understanding that they may not be showing up in the way that they thought or intended that they wanted to show up. And so, we saw that happen in hundreds and like I said, thousands of cases with individuals. I think one of the unfortunate things is that as a species, we tend to look at the negative more than we look at the positive. And I think you and I both know, because I know you've done some really excellent work in the space as well, that when unconscious bias work became kind of the shiny new penny, if you will, that all of a sudden a whole lot of people jumped and started doing that work. But as often happens when people pick up on the work that others have started, they don't necessarily do the deeper homework. And I think if there was one major insight that came out of doing the bias work, for me, it was that it's not really effective. I mean, forget the moral good or bad around it for a minute. It's not very effective to go out pointing fingers at people and tell them that they're bad, they need to change, especially when they don't realize or intend to be bad, because all it does is say to them that you're not seeing them, you're not knowing who they are. And so defensiveness gets up. But unfortunately, what happened when the bias work became so popular is that a lot of people with that old mindset, that kind of find them and fix them mindset, just stuck that conversation into that same old mindset. So it became, oh, you may not be biased, but you're unconsciously biased. It became one more attack line, which is ironic because it's inconsistent with the very nature of what the science tells us.
Mhm.
But nonetheless, this is what we do as human beings. And so we've seen a huge number of people who had extraordinary breakthroughs, both personally and collectively. But unfortunately, a lot of that's being hidden by the noise that's around it now.
Yeah, that defensiveness can be intense. What have you found the best ways to get around that, or to prevent it in the first place, or to kind of work through it? What have been your most effective strategies for that?
Well, I think we start by knowing that, and this also comes from the same science we're talking about, knowing that when people feel like somebody's trying to fix them, it triggers activity in the dorsal posterior insula of the brain, which is the same part of the brain associated with physical pain. And anybody who in a relationship has tried to fix their partner or spouse knows how well that doesn't work. And so I think this is, in effect, the mistake that I think many people have made in doing this kind of work, which is, we've strayed from the early days of the work, which really came out of Dr. King's admonition to build the beloved community. They say, how can we build those kinds of communities in organizations and in society where people trust each other, they value each other, they see each other, they feel each other, and they see the value in each other? That's really where we started. And over time, for many people, it evolved to, how do I change that person? How do I fix that person? So I think if we're going to reach people, we have to start by trying to have an understanding of what they're feeling, and particularly their fear. Because if you don't acknowledge people's fear, anything that you say will just cause them to dig in deeper to defend themselves. Once you acknowledge people's fear and acknowledge people's concern, and get into a conversation about that, which recognizes the humanity in that fear and concern, even if we don't share the same fear and concern about the same kind of people, once we acknowledge that, we have the opportunity for a conversation. I'm not saying it always works. Of course it doesn't. But we have at least an opportunity to get to the heart of what's motivating people in their beliefs and behavior.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. I think the most dramatic example of I've experienced of trying to kind of help people see that a workshop wasn't there to say you're doing something wrong, we're here to fix you, was working with a group of nurses right after COVID. And
Mm,
the folks who were bringing me into this health organization were like, they have no interest in going to this workshop. Like they're so tapped and so
right.
exhausted and do not want to be told they're bad people. And I was like, right, of course. So we just started the workshop by saying, my gosh, the work you've been doing is nothing short of heroic. Like, this is not about
Right.
you being bad
Right.
people, quite the opposite. It's just a new way to think about how to do what you're doing even better. And so that released so much emotion and defensiveness that we could then talk about what we were there to talk about. And so that was great.
Yeah, I
And
think, look, I mean, I think you're speaking to something that's really important, which is you need to pay attention to the way people are listening to what you're saying. What's the context for people listening to what you're saying? And I've said for many years to people, even if somebody's starving to death, shoving food down their throat's not the answer. We still have to find a way to get to people.
yeah, yeah. What about the climate today? Like, how is that challenging for this thing that we're talking about? I think what are you finding in your work with how things have changed in the past, whatever we want to say, 11 months, 12 months?
Yeah, absolutely. It's been touched on, this idea that there's a fear of people making each other wrong. But I think one of the challenges that we face when it comes to being with that fear is that it's so much easier to just lean away from the discomfort. To track back to what I was saying before, Robert Putnam wrote a book called Bowling Alone, which discusses the dissolution of the American third place. And
Mm,
I think the tagline of the book is the death of American collectivism. And it's this idea that we lean into a more individualistic, excuse me, culture because we are just in the United States and in our particular flavor of capitalism, that's what it looks like. And so what ends up happening is that people have much more capacity to lean away from group identity. And what we see amplifying that is social media and how I mean, we need connection. It's a fact. Instead of physical touch and the actual sensation and experience of being present with people, sharing eye contact, being face to face, we can sit behind a keyboard and get all of the dopamine hits we want about being right. And so what the result is that people lean away from places where they can be challenged in a healthy and meaningful way to self-examine, to grow, to actually have these difficult interpersonal conversations about things like how bias is affecting interpersonal relationships. And instead, it's become a much more common part of the narrative to just drop people and walk away. Because for better or for worse, the world is a lot smaller than it used to be.
yeah.
Or our reach is a lot bigger. So somewhere in there is the point. But the point of it is that, Dunbar's number, which is the 150 people that we can keep track of, used to be this sort of gold standard for how we would frame our life because that
Mm,
represents more or less surrounding community. Whereas now, I mean, speaking for myself, I have 4,100 friends on Facebook. I don't
yeah.
even know most of those names at this point.
Right. Right. Yeah. Yeah, for sure. It's interesting when I say, is this current context affecting this today? There's so many ways to interpret that. Like, there's social media, like you're talking about. There's certainly AI, and we'll get into that. There's also just the politics of the day and what's going on with that. Howard, you've been doing this work for so long, and you've seen kind of the leaning into this work, the leaning out with this work. What are your reflections on just where we are today in terms of just trying to do work with organizations to make sure everyone feels valued and included?
I have been doing this work professionally for 40 years, and I've been engaged in it in my life for 60 years. So since I was 14 or 15 years old. So you do see patterns, and I do think that there's value in having a historical view, because we know that this has never been a straight line. It's always been 3 steps forward, 2 steps back. You know, if we look at American history, we go back, we had emancipation, and then we had Reconstruction, and Reconstruction folds and the black coats come in. And then we had, you know, soldiers going off to World War I, and lots of black soldiers and starting to send money back. And we see the riots in Tulsa and the anti-black riots in Tulsa and in 50 other cities across the country during the summers of 1919, 20, and 21. And I could continue, but we all know that this is the way the pattern works. And right now, clearly, we're in a retrenchment. There's it's a combination of things. I think on one hand, there's what I call a terrorist campaign against DE&I. DE&I has been chosen as a target, not because of what it produced, but because of what it represents in terms of this whole anti-woke movement. And that is the notion that caring about other people, doing things in the best interest of other people, worrying about other people's needs is somehow, weak or whatever. But there's also, we have to acknowledge, those of us who are in the space, as we were saying earlier, have to acknowledge that there are also some missteps. And I think particularly post-George Floyd, there was some overreach on people's part that came out of people's pain, understandably, and frustration and all of that. But it did give fodder to those who were trying to make up a story. I know I had a colleague call me for some advice. He's a man in his mid-50s who is a longtime liberal, civil rights, and he has a stepchild who at 12 years old was thinking about transitioning. And he was always pro-LGBTQ rights, including trans rights. But he said, I just wonder if 12 years old is too early for them to be able to make this decision for themselves. And so I'm struggling with this. I want to support them, and at the same time. And he shared this with some folks in his organization. It was basically canceled out by the people in the organization for inquiring into this. And I think when we see that kind of extreme, you're going to give people fodder to generate this attack. But it's also important to recognize that that's not what the source of this attack is.
Yeah, and that those kinds of things weren't the norm, right? This is what happens when I listen to someone like a Robbie Starbuck, who will cherry pick ridiculous examples of the
Right.
things that have happened, and then assume that was the norm of what was happening, which it very much was not.
Yeah. And name me a profession where you don't have some people who do stupid things. I mean, you've got doctors who do stupid things. You've got lawyers who do stupid things. I mean, there's CEOs of corporations who do stupid things all the time. So yes, of course, there are diversity practitioners who've done stupid things.
Yeah.
But that doesn't mean the entire field is not of value.
No, not to mention malicious things, not just stupid things, but actual malicious things. Yeah, Jake.
To touch on that element about the sort of cancel culture element as well. I think that one of the things that I'm seeing, particularly in my social and professional spheres, is that there's a lot of fear around curiosity. And curiosity being one of the most foundational elements of the human condition, when we start to be curious about how other people think, how other people feel, how we create the world around us, that's when we can learn and grow. And there's this narrative that having curiosity about how our viewpoints might not be nurturing to the narrative at large inherently makes us a bad person. And, it leans into this conversation of bias. And I mean, the title of the first chapter is If You Are Human, You Are Biased, which is true. I mean, bias is a self-protection and survival mechanism, but it's become so readily demonized to have curiosity about how these biases show up that people become afraid to self-examine. And when we're not looking at the ways that we're biased, they're going to come out anyway. They just come out without intention.
Before we leave that point, if I could just, I think it's important for us to recognize too that all of this happens in the context of this tribalized society that we're in right now, that we've moved from sort of a bell curve society, which most of us spend most of our lives in, where you had, people in the extremes, but different points of view, and people could share different points of view. And it was basically um, basically issue oriented. I might disagree with you about foreign policy, but agree with you about civil rights, for example, that sort of a thing. But we've moved from that to what I call a dumbbell curve society now, where everything's on the end and nothing's in the middle. And it's no longer about issues, it's about identity. So it's no longer, what do you believe? It's, you're one of them and I'm one of us. And if we put that in the context of what Jake was just talking about, we can see that if I'm feeling challenged now, I want to go to a safe haven. I want to go someplace where I feel secure. And if the only choices I have are these two more extreme ends, I'm going to choose one of them and be pulled into a more extreme point of view on either side than I might normally do. The nuance goes away because now I'm part of the group membership instead of really engaging in kind of curiosity and nuance that Jake's talking about.
Yeah, for sure. For sure. It is not helpful. That sort of polarization. Sometimes people feel scared, like you're saying. And then sometimes I think a lot of it is disingenuous. It's like this excuse, like, I'm just being curious. What? I can't say this. I can't ask about
Right.
this. But it's not
Right.
genuine curiosity. There's no listening if someone
Yes.
does take you at your word and try to share
Yeah.
with you, right? What's changing in the second edition of the book? I want to go back to that. Like, in the years that it's taken since you've written it, like, what's changed? What are you adding? What are you actually editing? Like, what has changed and what is new?
Mm.
Jake,
Well,
you want to
maybe
start with what's
yeah.
new?
Why don't we start with Jake because he's really added the new stuff
Yeah.
more than I have.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, the core two pieces. I wrote two chapters in full. One on bias in social media and the impact that that has on our. I mean, talking about collectivism, the way that that influences the way that we show up and engage with each other, and the other on bias in AI and how there's a sense of over reliance on truth and I guess a desire to have truth be easy. And I think that's sort of the broader impact of AI as a whole is that at present AI is startlingly sycophantic, and we as human beings, I mean, we're talking about this relationship that we have with curiosity, and the fact is that curiosity can be really challenging.
Yeah.
You know, when we want to explore all the narratives of the world, but there's so much information right now, and to streamline it just makes things easier. And so there's this fixation on the ease of access to truth, the result of which being, I mean, we, just for the sake of argument, we asked to see what ChatGPT thought of the chapter that we wrote, and it wrote a glowing recommendation of the part where I called it a sycophant. It's hysterical. It was so appropriate that I put it in the book.
It's true.
It was so on the nose. It was like the element on sycophancy is the moral and emotional heart of the chapter. I was like, read the room.
Can you,
Um,
I think people know what that word is, but can you just get a simple definition in case people are wondering what that word means?
sure, yeah. I guess I would define it as the shameless and unthoughtful celebration of whatever the case may be, shameless and unthoughtful celebration of a person's word, etc.
Think sucking up.
Mhm.
Yeah, there you go. Yeah, there you go.
Yeah.
Yeah, and but anyhow, that's sort of what we were writing on with AI
Mhm.
with social media, and I keep coming back to this just because I do think that relative to the notion of bias, belonging, and community, social media is actually arguably one of the most dramatic, influential pieces of our time, at least to date. And what I write about in that chapter is how the the directions of the algorithms and the ease of access to being unchallenged by people we don't want to face in combination with the accessibility to dampening empathy and compassion that comes from not looking a person in the eye and the capability of experiencing them, excuse me, as less than human
Mhm.
has allowed for us to self-select for our own biases in a much more aggressive way than we ever have been able to in the past. And the result is that people, and we'll sort of circle back on this, but there's a fellow named Daryl Davis, who we write about in the book as well, who was a black man who started going to KKK rallies because he didn't believe that somebody could sit down across the table from him and hate him,
Mm,
at least not in the way that they did.
mm.
There are plenty of deeply admirable, upstanding people who I don't want to sit face to face with, but the point being that this notion of self selection has allowed for us to turn off our empathy as a broader scale. And I think for myself and what I contributed to the book, that is the core element that I believe in, is that it's more important than ever to sit face to face with people we don't agree with and remember that they are human.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, it's, you know, confirmation bias was bad enough. Like without these algorithms, it's like
Mhm.
confirmation bias on steroids.
Well, it
Um,
is. That's a really interesting component of this, Michael, because if you think about it, what are the things that what's our experience of relating to AI? One is the sycophant of this, as Jake's talking about, this sort of obsequiousness that it's like this machine likes me, it talks nice to me, it always says great question, and
yeah,
all these great things that are built in, and it builds knowledge. So, for
yeah.
example, I'm a musician, as I think you know, as well as my interest in some of these other things. And I asked,
Mhm.
going in to look for some research, said, well, as a musician, you'd probably be interested in this. So it's resonating with what I'm interested in on one hand. And secondly, I inherently know that it knows more than I do. And so if you've got something that you think likes you and you believe knows more than you do, you're going to have a tendency to listen to it more. And what we found in the research was that, in fact, AI in that sense generates more rigid bias than face-to-face interaction does.
Yeah. Oh gosh. And it's scary the way it works. Like I remember first starting to use ChatGPT and asking it some
Yeah.
questions, and at the end of a response it told me like, "You're doing great work, Michael." And I was like,
Right.
the fact that it felt good freaked me out. and and here's the I mean, and I don't know, maybe you probably know this, Jake. Like, so my chat GPT is telling me I'm doing great work. Is Robbie Starbucks chat GPT telling him he's doing great work? Like, it's just sycophantic for you.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's interesting because the root of the sycophancy is, it's not that it wants, how do I describe it? It's not that it's just there to suck up. That's not its purpose. That's not what it exists for. It's there to, and our friend Lauren actually wrote a great piece on this. Its purpose is that it wants to be right, much like human beings do, but it wants to be right. And if it can't be right in a way where it can appropriately challenge you, it wants to be right in a way that you will still feel like it showed up for you, I guess is the best way I can describe it. And it's the reason why in the first iterations, ChatGPT would do things like make up sources or fabricate scientific journals in order to substantiate its arguments. It has a really deep desire to be competent because it's trained to believe that its sole purpose is to demonstrate competence,
Yeah.
which, I mean, if we can scale it out and really look at it like that, how many of us were taught otherwise?
Mhm.
I mean, I happen to be very fortunate that I wasn't directly told that. But the unfortunate side is that being raised by somebody who gets an introduction like you've given is that the inherent bar is as such.
Yeah. I mean, sticking with this topic, certainly there's tons of research about the bias, the racial biases, the gender biases that are
Mhm.
built into AI. And so, there are so many examples of that, right? Then I've also had people who are very optimistic about AI's ability to potentially reduce bias, like to get rid
Mhm.
of the biases in performance reviews or whatever. Like, where, with all your research and thinking on this, where did you end up coming down on this idea?
I think that the point you make is exactly where it came back, which is this is a both and. Like any other new technology of sufficient impact, it's going to have both its light side and its shadow side. And I think that there's no. I mean, look at a very material level. I could tell you, I originally wrote Everyday Bias back. It came out in 2014, and then I did an update. It wasn't considered a new edition, but just an update a few years after that. But the amount of time it took to do research now versus then was astonishing. Something that might have taken me 10 days to find then took me 2 minutes to find now. Now I always included extra time to check that research for the very reason that Jake said, because one of the challenges that people forget about with AI is that as AI goes out into the world of the internet and every place else to gather information, if you ask it about a topic, it may not be able to discern between what's in a scientific journal and what's on Newsmax. You know what I mean? It's gathering all this data and it's saying, here's what people are saying. But that you still need to go in and say, what is this is credible and where comes from a credible source? Where is this information coming from? And of course, it's easy to do. The links are right there. So you can go click on the links. But unfortunately, most people in our rush to get something out or just laziness don't bother to follow up on that. And then people put something out thinking that it's legitimate, only to find that it was, like I said, it was something that somebody said in an interview somewhere that has no credibility at all. So I think that we have to be really careful about that, even as we do see the value of this amazing capability of bringing the entire world's intelligence to our fingertips in a matter of seconds has obviously huge potential positive impact as well.
Yeah, for sure. That need to check ChatGPT came on so strongly one time when I was first getting excited about it, and then I was having it give me trivia questions to ask my kids, and we were playing a game, and it ended up coming back and telling me that Arizona was one of the states that didn't have a Z in its name. I was like, buddy, I can't trust you with anything now.
Right.
Like,
Exactly. And that's the kind of stuff that you need to watch out for.
mhm.
Yeah. And if I may, I would also like to clarify that the book is not anti-AI.
No.
In fact, I think that being anti-AI is not, I mean, my personal opinion is that I don't think it's an appropriate standpoint because it's here and it's not going anywhere. It's pervading every single corner of our lives. And in the next 10 years, it will become arguably the most pervasive technology on the planet, ubiquitous in every form.
And
And
10
I
years is
think
probably conservative in that regard.
that's probably true, but I think that the
Yeah.
level to which it becomes integrated in society at that time will be to the point where ubiquitous can be taken as a definition. But I think that and I mean, for goodness sakes, the Nobel Prize this year in, I want to say, chemistry was awarded to the people who designed AlphaFold, which is a protein folding predictor AI algorithm that helps with drug discovery and genetic research. And I shouldn't speak more because I don't understand too much more about it. But the point is that
Mhm.
AI nurtured the Nobel Prize in either biology or chemistry this year. And, there's another layer to it as well, which is that the company that I work for is actually designing a system that allows multiple AI to answer the same question simultaneously and then summarize the ways that it agrees and disagrees. So you can look
Mhm.
at where they think similarly, where they think differently, and where they make unique points. Um, Similarly, a friend of mine runs an AI recruitment firm, and his firm uses an AI system to remove racial identity signifiers from resumes before submitting them to the broader database so that certain things that might otherwise be flags are not there. And of course, that still leaves, things like college education bias and stuff like that,
Mhm.
but that's a little bit more deeply ingrained. But this idea that AI can be the solution to a lot of the things that we're leaning on to highlight the problem at the moment is a very real one. And there's a lot of these opportunities for these systems that we've built that we're leaning into to also be supportive of the solution of reducing the bias that we want to see in the world. I think what it really comes down to is this sense that we live in a virtual space where self-selection for what we want to see for confirmation bias, but more, I think confirmation bias is, I think active confirmation bias is
Mm-hmm.
more what I want to say, or
Yeah.
is this sense that we may be aware of it, but there's so much opportunity to choose it that, what we really drive home in the book, and certainly for myself and the parts that I contributed, is that we encourage people to choose to be curious, choose to be challenged.
Yeah, that's great. Is the writing for the second edition done? When does it come out?
Yeah, the manuscript's in the publisher, and we're in that little nip and tuck stage. I mean, it won't be out until probably until the summer, but we're publishing through Rowman and Littlefield, who's now owned by Bloomsbury, and Bloomsbury has a little bit of a longer publication cycle. But yeah, it's in, and we're getting John Powell, who's the director of the Otherness and Belongings at Berkeley, is writing a foreword for us, which we're very excited about.
Yeah.
We're looking forward to getting it out in the world, and particularly these new conversations.
And so how has it been working together? You're not the first parent-child duo that I've had on here writing a second
No,
edition
just
together.
just
I
recently,
I had
actually, I
Mary
think. Yes,
Frances and
yes,
her
of course,
daughter,
our good friends.
Raisha.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yes, yes,
So how's
yeah.
that going, the collaboration?
Jake, why don't you jump in that first?
Sure, yeah. I think that there's a unique advantage that we have, which is that we came into this having spent a decade, I mean, a lifetime truly, but particularly the last 10 years of really intensive interpersonal relational work to focus on how we can treat each other with respect, acknowledge how our parental relationship has influenced our active, collaborative and other facets of our relationship before we even began to endeavor into this. But also I did make a bit of a joke about this earlier, but there is a reality to this sense of the desire to step up and earn a seat at the table.
Mhm.
And, it's been interesting because I have a historical wound around, I mean, you said it to start out, but I'll reiterate, I very much admire and respect my father. And as anybody who has read or experienced his work, your work, knows that it's a worthy admiration. And so it's not just a professional, but a personal admiration. And so for myself, one of the things that's come up there is this sense of desire around wanting to prove myself as worthy of that. But it's been really lovely in that regard because our interpersonal relationship has given space for the sloppiness of any given collaboration, let alone with historical contexts to grow. And in fact, just probably a week and a half ago, we had a moment where I got frustrated. I reacted. I called someone for advice, and then I called and apologized and recognized that who I was showing up as was the son who still feels a sense of frustration as opposed to a collaborator. And so it's great because I actually feel like my capability as a collaborator has been strengthened by the grace with which Howard is willing to receive me in my unrefined edges so that I can lean more into how I want to show up professionally in this. And all that is to say, it's been a blessing. It's an
Yeah.
absolute delight. And I would say that, it's wonderful to have the excuse to talk every day about this, but the truth is we talk on the phone every day anyway. So
That's awesome.
Yeah, I would say, Michael, that I started this process writing this book with my son, and I ended it writing it with a colleague.
That's
Um,
lovely.
I think that anybody who's listened to our first half hour or whatever it's been together here can see that Jake has substantive knowledge and experience and an incredible ability to articulate this stuff on his own right, having nothing to do with me. And I think as a parent, one of the things that we always experience, I know you have children, and we always experience is that individuation process. It's sort of this tethering process that starts when they're
Uh-huh.
2 years old, and you decide how high is the sliding board you want to let them try, and they go on and on and on out into the world. And I've been really blessed because I've got four sons, all of whom have been really successful in the world. But Jake's the first one who really has gone into my field.
Hmm.
And so we sat together a few weeks ago. We were in Philadelphia because we went to the annual summit for the MAP program, the Masters of Positive Psychology program. He
Hmm.
invited me to go with them. And I just watched him interacting with his colleagues. And afterwards, we were having dinner. And I said to him, I am releasing you from being my son in this professional relationship. And, my commitment to you is that moving forward, I'm going to relate to you as a younger colleague who has substance and something to offer in and of himself, because that, in fact, is the transformation that happened. And I think that, there are times when, and Jake just mentioned this thing that happened a week and a half ago, there are times when we have to stop and say, which relationship is running the show here? This is another form of unconscious, am I reacting to this like he's my kid? Am I reacting to this like
Yeah.
he's a colleague? Like, you were supposed to get me that thing last Tuesday. If you were a colleague, I would have called you Wednesday morning and said, where is it? As his kid, I know he's busy, and I had to get off of that and say, no, I'm relating to him as a colleague. Where is it? So, so I
Yeah.
think it's an interesting dance, but I think like everything else in life, it starts and ends with awareness. And I think that, the more aware we are, that's where the learning comes from. And in the end, what I had was an ability to write this book with somebody who had a base of knowledge and a perspective that was deeper than mine in some very important areas, and also who brought a generational perspective that was incredibly important to this topic in this day right now. And so, so it ended up being perfect in that sense, not just because I love my son and it's great to be working with my son, but also because I think he added exactly what was needed for the book to take it to another level.
Yeah. Oh, that's great. Yeah. I love talking about issues in the world, serious things with my kids and getting that generational perspective. I mean, their ages run from 22 down to 12, so I get a wide variety. But
Right.
but I do love that. There,
If I may, sorry,
yeah, go
if
for
I
it.
may just add one more thing to that, and thank you, Howard, Dad,
Yeah.
for that. The one thing that I'll say, and I do mention this in acknowledgments as well, is that a big part of what's been so inspiring about this, that it's a quote. I think it's often attributed to Isaac Newton, but it's, if I've seen farther, it's only because I've stood on the shoulders of giants. Now, for context, and those of you who don't know, Howard is 6'5", but there's the element of it as well, which is a source of deep and profound gratitude, which is that I got to do an amazing thing working with my father on a project, but I also had the immense privilege of co-creating and collaborating with the extraordinary Howard Ross in this field. And so my gratitude is twofold in that, which is that it was a really powerful experience for my personal well-being, but also on a professional level. I mean, he's awesome. So
Yeah.
I just wanted to say that. Thanks.
I'll second that. Um, that's really beautiful. I was thinking about, being a dad and being in the work that we do, and I recalled this funny thing where I was being interviewed for the BBC, and it was when Disney movies put like warnings in the beginning of the films about like
Mhm.
outdated cultural representations, and
Right.
so they're asking about it, and I explained that like, yeah, there's some maybe problematic messages around race or ethnicity or gender, sexuality, and so I don't stop my kids from watching Disney movies, but I'll watch it with them, and we'll pause and
Mhm.
we'll talk about it. And one of the comments was, "I would hate to be his kids." Like, and I just we had a good laugh about that. There are some others that are funny too, where somebody called me a sanctimonious killjoy, and now whenever my kids are mad at me, like when my 12-year-old's
That's
mad at me, he calls me a sanctimonious killjoy.
Now you're in trouble when your kids are getting insults from your internet trolls. That's the
I
thing.
know. I know, but it cracks me up because it's like
That
I
is
can tell.
funny.
I know he's mad, but he's also making an inside joke.
Right, right, exactly. So he's got a
So
sense of humor about his anger, right?
exactly. So I was gonna ask Jake if you have any funny stories of growing up with your dad in that respect.
It's funny. I'm sure that there are funny stories. More lately, I've been reflecting on the sort of deeper, deeper meaning level of the things. I'm sure that a funny story will come, but I do think that there is an important element to look at when it comes to these types of things, which is actually something that I'd like to celebrate about the current generation, which is that I'm in my 30s, and when I was growing up in the 90s, it was we hadn't really come to talk about the conversation of the depth of impact around bullying and teasing and all of these things. And so there was sort of this way of being where the bullies were still the cool kids and the cool kids were still the bullies. And, no shade on anybody who I grew up with. I will say that just about everybody who I ever called a bully has grown up to be a really respectable human being. And I've kept in touch with a number of them. But there's this sense that it was cool to be aloof or disrespectful or what have you, to not care, as it were. And I feel enormously grateful for what was at the time very challenging, which is the sense that Howard really taught me how, and my mother, and I don't want to write off my mother. I know that she's not here. This is a conversation between all of us. My mother is an amazing woman and an amazing mom, and I want to really highlight that. There's this sense that it was instilled in me, this narrative of empathy and of thoughtfulness and consideration around how do we address people who are different? How do we acknowledge that people are different without drawing attention to it in such a way as to other people? And what I found at the time was that being raised to have emotional vocabulary and thoughtfulness and empathy and compassion made it really hard to have friends my age.
Mm,
And it's really interesting when we look at this that this is a true thing of a lot of people who are like me. Actually, a lot of hypersensitive kids had a really hard time relating to people their age because it wasn't what was talked about. It wasn't how kids were taught, and it made adolescence particularly difficult because I wanted depth in my relationships because I had depth in my relationship with my parents and I had depth in my relationship with my parents' friends. I was raised in a beautiful community, and that's continued throughout my life. So it was really challenging to have. I mean, there was a thing we stopped the movie to point out the racial and unconscious implications and why things are challenging and problematic or whatever. But we would also stop to look at why it was that someone had their feelings hurt and how it was that we can be better. And so, one of the things, just to come back to the original point, that I'd like to celebrate about the current generation, and obviously it's not a blanket statement because those aren't appropriate at any level, but
yeah.
there's this narrative that being kind, being compassionate, calling out microaggressions, calling out macroaggressions, holding bullies accountable, all of these things that the younger generation is doing, it's become cool,
Mm,
and we celebrate this sense that actually acknowledging people for their humanity is what has people be popular and celebrated and cool. And it's a really beautiful thing. I'm enormously grateful to have been raised that way, but I'm also grateful to live at a time when I can watch that expand. And Howard has six grandchildren, and watching my nieces and nephews grow up into a world where it's more appropriate to call a person out for using a slur than it is to use a slur,
mhm.
and get a laugh. It's a really wonderful thing, and I feel enormously grateful for having been raised in such a way, not only where that's what I was taught, but where at almost 32 years old, that's what I get to celebrate in others.
Yeah, that's beautiful. I love that. And it's so important being able to have those conversations at young ages. How are you familiar with any research that looks at whether, young people in this generation have the same biases, same unconscious biases as other generations?
Yeah, I mean, I have seen some research that people specifically ask that question. Generally speaking, what it points to is the biases are different, but the tendency to bias is no different. Because as Jake said before, it's a survival mechanism. We wouldn't survive without bias any more than we could survive without breathing. I mean, the simplest way to think about it is, what does bias do? Bias says, watch out for this thing, it's dangerous. Or watch out for this person, it's dangerous. Imagine walking through a city and not knowing, not having already filtered that cars are dangerous. It's not like we step out in the street and say, I wonder what happens when that big heavy metal object on wheels comes. We instinctively know to jump out of the way. And so bias is always going to be with us as a fundamental functioning. And I think one of the challenges we made in the early days of diversity work in dealing with bias is we explored the sort of fanciful notion we can make bias go away. We talked about anti-bias trainings and non-biased decision making. When in fact, what we realized over time was it's actually not trying to make it go away that's going to do anything, because it will never go away. And trying to make it go away will actually force it underground, even more deeply unconscious. But what actually does help is acknowledging that it's there and acknowledging, taking responsibility for it and saying, okay, I do have this tendency to like this kind of person more than that kind of person. I don't know where that came from, maybe, or maybe I do. But one way or the other, I'll have to keep that in mind when I'm interviewing people like that, and make sure that the questions I'm asking them are not leaning one way or the other, to make sure that my interpretation of their answers are not influenced by that. Now, that's not going to 100% fix it, but it's a hell of a lot more likely to address it in a constructive way than by pretending it's not there. And I think that's true. And it's also true for this need for a sense of belonging, particularly in a culture, as Jake said before, which prides itself on individualism and we can do it on our own, when the truth is the human species needs to be around other people. We now know, in looking at Maslow's famous pyramid, that Maslow was wrong. That belonging is actually the baseline of the pyramid. And even Maslow, by the way, was starting to come to that towards the end of his life. But so I think that all of those things are critical in terms of our understanding that when we acknowledge something's there, we can work with it.
Yeah, and we can bake into, policies and procedures a way to mitigate against the impact.
Exactly.
Right?
Exactly. And you've done some great work. The work that you did with Tiffany Jana was great work in that regard.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah. What would be, I mean, you both work with groups and with organizations. What would be something surprising that people who are listening to the podcast might not realize about the work that you do? Like, what's something that would just kind of shock people that maybe is counterintuitive?
Gotcha.
I think that if I were to really boil it down, it's that all of this work, illuminating bias, taking accountability, coming with curiosity, relating to the person near us, every layer of what we talk about when it comes to community building, acknowledging bias, etc., can be explained in the inexplicable experience of sitting across from a person making eye contact.
Mm-hmm.
It is uncomfortable. It is vulnerable. It is raw. It is scary, but at its core, it's human. And so, to answer your question, that would really surprise people is the simplicity of it,
Mm-hmm.
which is that our goal is, I mean, the lofty goal is improve organizational cultures, build community, create a more equitable future where people are more gentle and open minded to each other. But the real root of the goal is, at least speaking for myself, and obviously Howard will answer next, is I want the people that I work with to recognize they are human and so are the people in front of them. And that when we can really get down to this shared humanity, we can start to realize that none of the labels, none of the defenses and the armor actually really matters. All that matters is that we are built, we are evolved into this place where our inclination is to celebrate, protect, and honor the people in front of us. It's in our code. And if we can really get down to that, the rest is just semantics.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Love it. Love it.
Hmm.
What about with your
Yeah.
work, Howard?
I
What
think,
would
I
surprise
think what I would
people?
say is, I used to tell my staff when I was still running Quick Ross years ago, we had 50 people, and, I would say, I want y'all to know I'm not committed to unconscious bias work. And then it would look, their jaw would drop, and then I would say, in fact, I'm not even committed to diversity work. And then their jaws would really drop. What I'm committed to is creating organizations along the lines of what Jake was describing a minute ago. And I believe that these are great tools to get there. But if I find better tools to get there, I'll use them. And I think that this is one of the challenges that we have as human beings, and it's really showing up for people in the DE&I space right now, I think, who are dealing with the frustrations that you and others are dealing with, trying to, continue to do work. And it's an interesting human phenomenon. We create a commitment to something, and then we develop a strategy to get to that commitment. And then if we're not careful, our commitment shifts from the ultimate commitment to the strategy. So just to give you a very easy example, I have a friend who started running when she was like 40 or 45 years old because she wanted to get herself healthy. She had never exercised a lot. At some point, 20 years later, her hip started to bother her. But at that point, she was committed to running that marathon, and she kept running herself right into a hip replacement, right? If she had remembered that she was committed to being healthy, she said this to me later, she said, if I remember I was committed to being healthy, I would have started swimming 10 years ago and stopped running. But the commitment shifted. And I think similarly, what's happening right now is that there are a whole lot of folks who were using diversity as a tool to create the kind of environment similar to like Jake just described, in which everybody had opportunity, was seen as human, was given their opportunity to be their best self, and could contribute fully to their organizations and whatever other language we want to put around that vision. And then we decided this kind of work, whether it's leadership work for some people or coaching work for some people or diversity work for some people, this kind of work will get us there. And then when people challenge this kind of work, we're like, oh my God, what do we do? But my response is, if the door is locked, look for the open window. Now, I'm not saying that's easy, because as we were talking about right when we started, before I think we got on the call, DE&I work is not the only work that's being restricted right now. It's almost any work around culture building in organizations has been slowed. But nonetheless, we also know, because of the history, that will come back. The pendulum does swing back in the other direction. And if we can remember what we're here for and start to find ways to move our focus towards that and not so much to any one way of getting there, then I think we'll be able to continue to move in a direction, because I think that those are the kind of environments that people do want to work in ultimately. People want to work in environments where they're respected. They want to work in environments where they're seen as included. But the reality is that a lot of people, especially, and we have to acknowledge that, people who look like the three of us have been not welcomed into that conversation in a lot of cases. And so as a result of that, they went where they could find a home.
Can you say more about that last point?
Yeah, I think that for years, it's been very sort of in and out, being a white man doing this kind of work, and I completely understand it, of course, and there's a lot of justification and reasoning behind that. But the challenge is that, when you have a body of work that's designed to change the overall structure of the way organizations are run, and when the people who are in those power and positions of power are whatever numbers we see, 70 to 80% of a particular group, and you don't welcome that group into that conversation, you're inherently setting up a challenge. And I think this is what happened, was a lot of corporate DE&I work got aimed at white men as opposed to inviting white men into the conversation. And it is now and always will be an enrollment conversation. You can't force people to change their attitudes. You've got to enroll them in why it's in their best interest and in their organization's best interest to potentially look at or inquire into new kinds of beliefs and attitudes. And I remember standing up, oh gosh, it's got to be probably around 2018. There was a meeting. You may have even been there. Right? We were at that meeting at Princeton. There were about 100 DE&I practitioners brought together by the folks who do the best practices, Alan and Julie and this stuff. Great session. But at some point I stood up in the room and I said, I'm going to say something that people may not like to hear. There are about 100 people in this room, and there are two of us who are straight white men. That's 2% compared to 70% in leadership. That's a problem, But, I can understand where people feel, on the other hand, like, given white men's history of taking over environments that we come into, why, some people would like to have an environment for themselves. So I'm not suggesting it's easy. It's very complex. But it is something I think we have to be aware of, which is that if we really are going to win with this conversation, it's got to include everybody.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, it's interesting the way you're talking about it, because it's not the way I've tended to think about it. I've tended to think about that problem more as white men not wanting to join those conversations, thinking that a DE and I conversation doesn't have anything to do with them if they're a straight white man, that it's not, that they don't have anything to contribute, it's not for them, and so they kind of self-select out often. Have you noticed that too?
Sure, there's no question that that's the case, and I think that some of that is that some of it is that people have what we might call regressive attitudes. There are certainly a certain segment of people like that. I think there's also a large number of people who don't know how to engage in that conversation, and they're afraid of the consequences of not engaging correctly or well. So when we're doing things like, and a lot of this stuff came up post George Floyd, we're doing things like saying, well, you may be trying to be an ally, but being a white liberal ally is worse than being an overt racist. You remember some people were saying things like that. You got to say, people say to me, well, I'll just stay out of this, because I'm damned if I do and I'm damned if I don't. So I think it's a both and. I think that we have to help people understand that they can have this conversation without being afraid of it being a gotcha game, which is how it's felt a lot of times for folks. As soon as I say the wrong word or use the wrong phrase or the wrong pronoun or the wrong this, and all of a sudden I'm one of them and I'm cast out. Maybe not physically, truly cast out, but nonetheless, I'm now seen as an other for having done that, as opposed to, can I invite you to see it somewhere differently? It's very different to say to somebody you're being a crummy ally than it is to say, look, I know you're trying. Can I give you some coaching as to how you could do that better in a way that could serve us better? Very different conversations.
Yeah, I mean that for sure. That's what I feel like is my responsibility, right? Like as a white person, because
Yeah.
I don't have the same frustrations and marginalizations that other people have had, and I don't
Hmm.
and I it's my responsibility to have the patience. Whereas I can imagine people getting so trying, like you're saying, trying genuinely so many times and then saying, forget it. Like
Hmm.
people don't really want to listen. The information is out there. They're not hearing. They're not seeing what my experience is. They ask and then don't care. Like, forget it. Right. So I can
And it's a
understand why
trap.
people, yeah, and I can see
Yeah.
why people are
Hmm.
frustrated. And then I take that on as like, I'm trying to get white people to see what other people might be too frustrated to explain another time, you know?
Well, and I
Hmm.
think that there's another element as well, which is that there's been this narrative in the contemporary diversity culture that privilege is a dirty word. When I think that the reality is, I mean, you talk about allyship, but the truth is that you know privilege can be a weapon, and so it is an important thing to realize that privilege, when utilized, can actually legitimize the conversations of the underprivileged. And it's a delicate balance when you look at the opportunity for white saviorship versus actually trying to make a difference. And that's when conscientious allyship becomes the real opportunity, is that if you have a person of color whose voice is underutilized, as a white person who might have an overvalued voice, you have a really lovely opportunity to turn the door handle.
Yeah, for sure. For sure. People have a hard time with that, knowing when to step forward and try to be an ally, thinking that maybe it's none of their business if it's not happening to them. Or this. You really have to, it's something you have to kind of practice and experience and occasionally mess up and have it feel uncertain. Like, did I do that right? Was that a good thing to do? Was that not a great thing to do? How could I have done that better? It's complicated, and I think too often people just because it's hard like that, they just kind of stay back instead. Yeah.
Well, I think that, yeah, and I think that there's no question that's true. And I think if we've learned anything from intersectionality, we know that this is not a unique conversation. It's one that hears, we hear most of the conversation about, white men versus men and women of color, that sort of a thing. But, we also know that we are responsible, if we're really looking at creating healthy environments, for creating environments that are psychologically safe for LGBTQ people, even if we're not in that community. We know that we want to do it for younger people, even if we're older. We know that we want to do, and I like to say, look, we're Jewish. I know Jewish people who rail against anti-Semitism, but then make questionable racial comments. I know people of color who who make questionable comments about gay people. I know gay people who make questionable comments about immigrants. I mean, do you know anybody who done got something going on with somebody? And so I think that, we have to accept that this is the common reality of the human experience. And for me, I don't see any way to get to the ultimate community we're getting to unless everybody rolls up their sleeves and participates in it, no matter what their identity is. There have been times when it's been seen as an advantage. People said, well, yeah, why don't you come in? Because you're a white guy. The leaders will like you better. So maybe it's been, then there are times when it's been a disadvantage. I could never hire somebody like you. People in my company would go crazy if I brought in a white man to do this. I'm sure you've heard the same thing, Michael, on both sides.
Yeah.
So all I can do is get up every morning and say, okay, what do I want to contribute today? And let the chips fall where they may.
Yeah. How do you, this is a great conversation. How do you think about the future? Like, what are your fantasies for a world where we're doing something real about bias? What are your fantasies for this world that are realistic or not realistic?
Jake, you want to start?
If I were to say, what is my fantasy for a world for myself, for my, maybe prospective children, for my nieces and nephews, for the people I care about, is I would love to see a world in which people really take a moment to be curious about, why do I feel that way? Where does this resentment come from? What's this judgment? And most importantly, what am I really afraid of right now? What is having me come to this with reactivity instead of thoughtfulness and consideration, and what is the root of that fear, and how can I be in conversation with that? We're supposed to be cautious and thoughtful and conscientious. Fear is a defense mechanism, and fear is also a necessary part of discerning life, and we don't have to like everyone. I don't,
No. Right. Right.
but it would be an ideal world for me if, when I don't like someone, I have enough spaciousness to come with curiosity as to, what is this trigger? Why does it remind me of my father? How can I really look at, the ways that this person's humanity can meet my humanity? As Baba Ramdas said, we're all just walking each other home.
Lovely, lovely. What about you, Howard?
I remain an optimist. I think that if we look at the experience of human history, and Steven Pinker wrote a great book about this called The Enlightenment Now a few years ago, you may have read, and he looks and he measures every standard by which we measure human performance, and every single one of them is better now than it's been at any time in human history, with the exception of one: human happiness, ironically. So, that's an issue that we need to deal with. And that's why this work that Jake is doing in positive psychology, I think, is so important, because we do by our nature tend to look at the negative. And I think that's something that we can reorganize ourselves towards flourishing, towards having a mindset of flourishing. It will take work, but we need to embrace that. But when we look at human history, like I said before, it's always been 3 steps forward and 2 steps back, but it always has been progressed. And even when we look at, there's been a lot of attention right now on totalitarianism, obviously, because of what's going on with our government, not just our government, but around the world. I'm a historian by training, so that's that's sort of my orientation by my nature. When you study what are called U-turn democracies, and that is democracies that have turned towards fascism or turned towards totalitarianism, like Italy and Germany in the 30s as great examples. In almost all cases, they came back to being more committed to their democracy over time. Now, there's damage done in between, and I'm not minimizing the amount of damage that's been done when abuelas are being dragged out of their homes and, put in zip ties and in black trucks and things like this. Obviously, there's damage being done, and I'm not in any way minimizing that. But when you ask me what the long-term view is, I think in the long term, what we've seen is that humanity continues to grow and expand. And my hope is that will continue. But the only way it's going to continue is if not by sitting back and say, well, we'll just wait for that to happen. It happens. And if we look at history, it happens time and again, because people stand up and say, enough of this. This is harming people. It's not right. It's not good for us. And it's not, as Jake was saying, what we want as human beings. And we tend to slide back out of the fear, back into being more reasonable, more thoughtful, and creating the kind of environments that we want to create. So my hope and prayer is that the damage that's done on the way to get there is as minimal as it can be.
Yeah, I hope so. Those are lovely. Thank you both. I feel like we could talk for hours and hours and hours.
Easily.
Certainly.
But we'll pause it. We'll say we'll pause it here.
Yes.
But one of the things I love to do is give people a sort of optional homework assignment. If they wanted to go read something or watch something or do something or journal something, what would you assign them to do if they wanted to do something immediate?
Well, I'll jump in this time. I would say study history. You know, I just recently read John Meacham's biography of Andrew Jackson, and also just recently watched Ken Burns' new, you know, American Revolution.
Yeah, I want to see that.
Like I said, I'm a history major, American history major, so I love that stuff anyway. But it's amazing to see how the same patterns that we're seeing now were showing up in slightly different format in Jackson's administration. You know, how, for example, when George Washington was forming the Revolutionary Army, the Continental Army, he required all of the soldiers to get vaccinated for smallpox. You couldn't be in the army if you didn't get vaccinated with smallpox. And then you put that in the context of people's going batshit over. I'm sorry, this technical term, going crazy over having been told to get COVID vaccination, so you can help save the lives of people around you. So I think history is really helpful for us, in that it gives us context for things. And I think at a time when we are when a lot of people are turning away from American history, from an honest telling of American history for sometimes nefarious reasons, it's more important than ever that we educate ourselves.
For sure. It's always been hard to get the real history from a multiracial, multicultural
Hmm.
perspective, but now with deliberate erasures, it's a whole nother ballgame.
Howard Zinn is more important than ever.
I was just thinking about that. I was just thinking about that. All right, Jake, what homework assignment would you give people?
Yeah, I think that there's a lot of things that I could say, but what feels most aligned for me internally right now, and particularly on the heels of Howard giving a more academic answer, is find an opportunity to be kind, but not just passively. Like, go out, find somebody who seems like you wouldn't agree with them. Find somebody who looks like somebody you wouldn't hang out with. Somebody who has a quality that intimidates you, and offer a hand. Buy them a cup of coffee. Go to the grocery. One of my favorite things to do at the grocery store is if I see somebody buying flowers in front of me, or behind me, I try and pay for them. So something simple. And my best advice for this is, if you can do that and not give your name, not tell them who you are, carry a couple extra bucks for somebody who might need it on the street. Go out of your way to tell somebody they look great, like if you really like their outfit, or even if you don't, but you think they do. Like, and as somebody who dresses on the more outlandish side, it makes a difference. But really, like, this sense that we dehumanize people as a matter of protection against having to look at the way that we are afraid to be confronted. We need to take more opportunities to really drop into that experience of being human. Make eye contact with somebody, thank somebody for whatever it is that they do. Thank them. It's more important than ever, both for people who don't get the opportunity to be acknowledged for being human. I'm thinking in my mind, delivery drivers in particular. We treat delivery drivers like drones, and we work towards a place where they might become that. But if certain forecasts of AI are to tell us anything, it's that there will come a time when there are a lot of people who are really struggling with the fact that parts of the ways that they've cultivated their humanity, namely work, might be replaced, will be replaced. People need to be reminded that we're human. So my best advice is, go out and treat somebody like a human being.
Yep. Love it. I
And
love the combo.
the good news about that too is that we now have research that shows it's not just a bumper sticker to practice random acts of kindness. When you do the things Jake's talking about, not only does it benefit the person you're doing it for, but you actually get a hit of oxytocin yourself. So actually you will find you'll be happier and feel more mentally balanced by doing the very things Jake's talking about, as well as the service it provides for others.
Yeah, beautiful.
There's one other thing that I'll add to that, and it's a part of my coaching practice that I'm still cultivating, which is the sense of lay just one domino. And the idea being that the great example, my fourth grade teacher. I don't remember her name, and if I bumped into her on the side of the road, I probably wouldn't recognize her. But her particular level of attention and care ended up having me move schools to make sure that I could get the kind of education that I needed, which opened up enormous doors for me, led to me getting an incredibly high quality education in middle school, high school, and then led to amazing opportunities for undergrad and graduate. And so, like I said, I don't remember her name, but that woman who took the extra bit of time to treat me like I had real opportunity instead of just a failed student made all the difference in the world for me. And so if we can just lay one domino, you know, it would be the greatest gift in my life if I were to never live to see the reach of my desire to treat the world with compassion.
Yeah, yeah. Beautiful, beautiful. Yeah, this has been amazing, this
Mm,
conversation.
really.
There's got to be a part two at some point in the future. But
Absolutely. You just let us
thank
know.
you. Thank you for
Would love
taking the
that.
time to come talk with us today. So appreciate both of you.
Thank you, Michael. It's always good to be with you. Really lovely.
Absolutely. All right.
That's a real pleasure. Thank you for having us.
Absolutely. All right. Bye, everyone.